you're here, which is so awesome. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm one of the programming librarians at the Cary Library, and I'm really pleased to be here for our reinvigorated science cafe. I was trying to think of like a Frankenstein type of thing, you know,
Animated?
Reanimated, that's right.
Yeah.
Science Cafe. So we have a lot of people to thank. But before we get to that, I just wanted to let you know that I have enabled captions on this program. You'll see them scrolling across the bottom of your screen. If you don't want them to, just click on where it says live transcript at the bottom of your screen and hit hide subtitles. But we like to be as accessible as possible. And so we love having captions for those who need them. This Science Cafe, reanimated Science Cafe, has been brought to us by the Cary Library Foundation. They have worked tirelessly to bring it back. They know how much people loved having it, and they also support and fund almost 100% of the adult programs at the Cary Library. So we couldn't do this, a lot of our programs without them, but especially this one. So we really are very appreciative of the Cary Library Foundation. And I would like to thank Jagesh Shah because he did do the Science Cafe before, and we have brought him back for a special appearance to do this very special one, with Mike Kennealy, and he will introduce Mike in just a minute. So I'm going to let you know a little bit about Jagesh. He is the founder of the Cary Library Science Cafe. He's a former Cary Library Foundation board member and a former academic, now turned biotech executive. You can see him around town coaching youth soccer. He claims that it's the best way to meet other Lexington scientists. And he was just talking about that. And I was like, well, that sounds like it's very true. So welcome, Jagesh. Thank you so much for bringing this back. And thank you, Mike, for being here. We're really happy to have you in our inaugural second wave or Science Cafe 2.0.
Thank you. 2.0. I like that better than
2.0. There you go. All right.
Yeah, there we go. 2.0. How it goes. Thank you, Mike, for being here. I mean, for those of you that are new to Science Cafe, it's always a way to kind of pull kind of our remarkable people from Lexington and how they're infusing science into our daily lives. And given the unprecedented times, the fact that science is part of almost every conversation we seem to be having, it seemed opportune to kind of bring in some people who are thinking a lot about science. The secretary said that, he's a political scientist. That counts, but I know that we're going to get into some science and how you've been using it along the way. We're thrilled to welcome the Massachusetts Secretary of Housing and Economic Development, Mike Nealy. As secretary, he's responsible for advancing the Baker-Polito Administration agenda to create an environment that supports job creation and business growth and new housing for residents through targeted investments. He's also been the co-chair of the Massachusetts Reopening Advisory Board. So he's been, front and center in the, in the pandemic. So we're going to talk a lot about that today. Mike and his family live in Lexington, and so kind of continuing the opportunities to bring in local Lexingtonians. As I just learned, if it's okay, Mike, I always put out a shout out for spouses. His spouse is also a Lexington celebrity. Cook, the chef at the Hastings Inn at Hastings. So you guys are known about town. So they've all, I know he's been involved in town government, education, as well as youth sports. And he served as the chairman of the board for the trustees at St. John's Prep. And he's also on the board of visitors at the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and Social Sciences at Dartmouth College, where he is an alum. So thank you again for coming. And usually we start at the beginning, and your beginning, kind of, having grown up in Massachusetts, kind of what were the early kind of influences in your life? Because, we're going to try to draw a line through what you've done and what you're doing now.
Yeah. Well, look, first of all, I'm really just delighted to be here. It's nice to do something here in town. Hopefully we get back to doing things in person sometime soon. And Trish and I and the kids have been here in town since the fall of '03. We love it here. We've been very involved in a lot of ways in Lexington, including my service on the Library Foundation board some years ago. So just great to be doing something here in Lexington. And I will say it's a little unnatural to be part of a science discussion, as was mentioned before. My degrees are government and business, but I'll do my best. But certainly, science has played a major role in our decisions being made over the past 14 months or so. I guess for me, in terms of sort of early kind of formative stuff, I knew very early on that I wanted to do public service. And that goes back really to my high school days. You mentioned St. John's Prep. That had a tremendously impactful, tremendous impact on me and kind of my view of the world and a sense of mission and wanting to do public service. That really was kind of hatched. That idea was in broad strokes was developed back then. Going on to Dartmouth and majoring in government. For me, I've always been fascinated by government and politics and the issues and policy. And so that's when I really decided this is the arena I wanted to play in at some point, because I think there's so much government can do. I did spend a bunch of years in business first, and that was really sort of by design. I thought if I could spend some time in the business world and learn a lot more about the economy and finance and how jobs are created, I could then at some point take that experience into the public sector. And so a lot of ways I've sort of had this plan for a long period of time. And I'm kind of on, I say now I'm on, 8 years into the sort of the second career in public service after about 19 years in the private equity business. But it's been just tremendously satisfying to be doing this work, particularly at this period of time in Massachusetts.
Well, yeah, these are unprecedented times. So, maybe we can, kind of connect with some of those current events, because I think that's a good deal about what our audience wants to hear. So, as you said, 14 months, we go back to kind of February, March of last year. And what is some of the first data that comes streaming in that kind of is on your radar that you need to start looking at?
I think for all of us as, the governor and the cabinet, we're all reacting to this when it first came in, and it was all just very new for us, right? And you started to hear about early cases and trying to figure out what it was all about. I think for obviously my colleagues who are more on the front lines of the healthcare system and public health probably had a more intimate knowledge of what was happening early on. But at some point, this became a whole of government approach to the pandemic. And so going back to the middle of March, we had a daily call as a cabinet with the governor for a very long time, like months into the pandemic. And the whole idea was, while this is it's a public health crisis, it's going to touch the economy in a big way. It's going to touch really everything government can do. And so the question was, how do we all report in data we're seeing and things we're learning about something that we never faced before, and also kind of how do we harness the sort of full power of government to address it? And very early on, so these dates are kind of seared in my memory, but March 10th, the governor declared a state of emergency. And then a few days later announced the formation of the COVID Command Center, which was meant to be sort of the focal point for all of our efforts. And so we were all just constantly communicating and understanding and trying to, interpret data and understand things. It became clear about 2 weeks into that exercise that we had to do something unprecedented, which was really start to close down the economy in a very major way. And so the other date in my memory is March 24th, where we this construct around, and I don't like this term because every business is essential, okay, but essential and non-essential businesses, and ones deemed non-essential had to close their physical locations. And you think about the economic and societal impacts of that. I mean, I could talk all night about that one, but that's an example of a decision we had to take very, very early on, which we thought then and still think now was the right decision from a public health standpoint, but just had enormous economic consequences. So those are some of the early, some of the very kind of early signs we had. We had a real problem on our hands. How do we harness the collective power of government to address it? And how do we take some really tough decisions that were right from a public health standpoint, but really, really difficult from an economic standpoint?
Yeah. So, again, I'm glad that you connected that. The shutdown is really a public health question. It's one that clearly was not taken lightly. There are some unique aspects of Massachusetts, the innovation environment, kind of what were some of the opportunities that, kind of that Massachusetts could take care of or could take advantage of that, kind of you guys immediately were able to deploy?
Well, that's a great question, and I again, a topic I could talk all night on. There are so many attributes of our state that are special, unique, differentiated, and I feel like so many of them came to the fore in this crisis. I mean, first of all, we are, the global leader in life sciences, like, period, end of story. I'll argue that one all day long. What we have here is unbelievably special, and so the work of the life sciences community to develop, vaccines, testing solutions. But that was just that is a Massachusetts story, and so we had a lot to work with there. The healthcare system, an unbelievably sophisticated healthcare system. I mean, in terms of just being on the front lines and battling the pandemic, the work of the healthcare system here. The governor formed a COVID advisory group early on, and if you look at the names on that list, I mean, that would be, and they're all in Massachusetts. That's like a global hall of fame of healthcare professionals, right? So we had just incredible talent we could tap. I think the other thing that's been true really throughout is we are, as much as people talk about how difficult politics are these days, and they are on a national scale, in Massachusetts, we are an unbelievably collaborative place. And it's been that way for a long, long time. We are bipartisan, collaborative, data-driven. People jump in and try to figure things out. And for all the really hard decisions we made and all that we've asked of people, I think there's been incredible buy-in to the overall plan. We'll talk about the European plan at some point, I'm sure, but we are unique in that regard. I think we have, I think we have the best governor in the country. I think he's an exceptional person and governor. I'm proud to work for him. But so many of our special attributes really came out at that point. The incredible life sciences ecosystem here, the incredible healthcare system, and this sense of bipartisan, data-driven collaboration, and with that, a population that respects science, and I think that generally wants to do the right thing. We had a lot of advantages. We were among the hardest hit states by COVID. We're probably number 3 behind New York and New Jersey. So we were dealt a tough hand in that regard. But you look at the really special attributes we have to deal with that, it's really pretty exceptional.
Yeah, that's exciting to hear. I mean, certainly, kind of to be, for somebody who has his office in Tech Square and gets to see the Moderna sign like almost every day, it's a very proud moment to know that, right. This is happening, locally. In terms of the, as we think about kind of things shutting down, there are a number of other crises that emerge, the inability, just the burden on the healthcare system. And I think, one of the things that we had actually talked about before was, things like access to PPE, access to, we talked a little bit before about some of the opportunities that, may not be kind of healthcare related, but really another set of innovation industries that kind of stepped up in Massachusetts. And I just want to, have you talk about that.
I'd love to talk about what we've done in manufacturing. So we've, and again, this kind of spirit of collaboration. So we've had something for a long time now in the state called our Advanced Manufacturing Collaborative, which I co-chair. And in true Massachusetts fashion, it's a mixture of government, business, and academia. And we meet once a quarter. We talk about how do we grow advanced manufacturing in the state. How do we promote the state? How do we identify sites? How do we solve workforce talent pipeline issue? How do we make this some of the best place to build a manufacturing company? Now, we all heard about the shortage of masks and face shields and gowns and testing supplies, PPE kind of broadly defined early on. And I think our first meeting of what became our manufacturing emergency response team happened on March 25th or something. So really early on, we got everybody back on the phone and we said, look, we're going to come up with a solution to make more of this stuff and make it here in Massachusetts. And I can't say enough about that effort. I mean, it was incredibly collaborative. You think of what goes into that. Okay, so we're going to ask our manufacturers who never made this stuff before to repurpose their production lines and start making these products in a way that the state can become, sort of self-sufficient as fast as possible. So we have now 50 companies that have participated in this. We gave out $16 million in grants to help them with a lot of aspects of that process, including workforce. And they've made about 15 million pieces of this equipment so far. And the sort of forward pipeline of what they think they're going to make is over $100 million. And we have companies now that are making N95 masks, for example, here in Massachusetts at a scale that means we'll probably never have a problem with that again. And so that is just, when the governor first announced this, he said, he used the term inspirational. And I still use that term to describe it today. It was kind of the best of Massachusetts on display. And all the challenges in how do you help someone make that stuff in terms of, design. You got to design a product, the specifications for it, the manufacturing process. You got to get through a regulatory hurdle. You got to develop the workforce. There's a lot that goes into that. And we had sort of dedicated work streams for every step of that effort, including some of the best minds in higher ed to help address it. So it was really a pretty exceptional effort. Started really in kind of the earliest, darkest days of the pandemic.
Yeah, well, that's exciting to hear. I mean, these are these kinds of collaborations, kind of aren't always thought of as working together so well, right? These are, groups that sometimes kind of can butt heads, but when we need them, they've really stepped up. So
it's a cultural point about our state. I've had people in other states ask me, geez, how can we start doing something like this? And my flip response I don't give to them is we should have started 5 years ago with an advanced manufacturing collaborative, and I had all these relationships ready to go at that point. So
yeah, absolutely true. So as we go through now, kind of March, April, you guys clearly had a lot already on the books. I think it's somewhere in May that I think the Baker administration lays out a plan. Right. And I wanted to get a sense of how we're doing against that plan, because my read of it is pretty good, but maybe get a read from you.
My read is pretty good as well. And let me, if I could, maybe spend a few minutes on how we developed the plan. So the governor asked the lieutenant governor and myself to co-chair a reopening advisory board. And the thought was, let's convene a relatively small board of people who could help advise on our reopening plan, and then sort of engage very broadly with a whole other set of stakeholders. And so our board was 17 people. We had 3 people from the healthcare community, including Rochelle Walensky, who's now head of the CDC. So pretty good person to have on a reopening advisory board. So 3 from healthcare, 3 from municipal government, 11 from business, representing a very diverse set of kind of sectors and regional perspectives. And so our mission over a 3-week period of time, and by the way, that work kicked off a year ago this week, was to develop the reopening strategy for the Massachusetts economy. And that's 3 weeks of my life I'll never forget, and a very intense period of time. And we approached that work with a lot of humility and caution, because for 2 reasons. One is we were among the hardest hit states. And secondly, this is work that had just never been done before. You never had to develop a strategy to reopen an economy. And so there were a number of things that were sort of the foundational elements of that work. One was figuring out what the public health metrics were that were going to tell us when it was time to start reopening, and then when it was safe to move on to future phases. Another was the whole phased approach. And so we have 4 phases to the plan. Mm-hmm. And the thesis was if you reopen gradually in phases and start with things where there's not a lot of interaction with the public, you can then get onto things where there's more contact intensity, more public facing nature. And you can do that in a way where you can reopen the economy and not have a massive resurgence of the virus. We spent a lot of time developing safety standards and protocols. We have these mandatory safety standards that cut across all industries and all workplaces. We have very specific industry protocols for each of the industries that open. So there's a lot that went into that plan. And I would say, I think the plan has served us pretty well. The plan was launched May 18th of last year. It's going on almost a year now at this point, and that is still the plan. And I think when you develop something that early on, that's never been done before, someone had told me at some point, that may not be the plan. That was always a possibility, I guess, but that is still our plan. We're still executing against that. We made another announcement today on further reopenings, deeper into our phase 4 reopening. We had a couple setbacks in the fall, I think, as everybody saw the virus numbers spike. a couple of times in the fall, but we're still executing against that plan, and I'm still enormously grateful for all the folks who helped us develop that plan. In addition to the 17 members of the board, we did 50 hours of Zoom calls with 75 different groups over 3 weeks. And so we talked with every major industry association in the state, labor groups, community groups, nonprofits. We had this, again, cast this incredibly wide net and had folks, asked folks, come to us with your best ideas on a reopening. And it was just enormously helpful to have that much feedback from a lot of different voices in the state.
Well, kind of when as a scientist, when we think about, trying to make a plan that far ahead, and you think about the variants that emerged, you think about when will a vaccine actually emerge? We didn't have clarity around that, in April of last year. So, remarkable because, we have not, it's amazing that we're able to kind of keep that going. But, where are some of the places where you guys really had to dig in, where, things didn't go as planned?
When we designed it, we thought, okay, hopefully we just move sequentially from phase 1 to phase 4, right? And at some point we never came out of phase 3. We got into a later phase of later step of phase 3, then had to move back. And then we sort of tightened up some of the restrictions. For example, restaurants had to be at 25% capacity for a period of time. I'm not sure that was a flaw in the plan because we sort of designed it to go forward and backwards if needed. I think one of the really important aspects of this is the communications piece, where we were very clear about what the plan was and very clear that it could go backwards. Hopefully it doesn't. And the other really important notion in here is shared responsibility, that there were responsibilities for everybody. And so we had a few different levels of guidance. There was kind of the overall social guidance to people: wear a mask, maintain distance, wash hands, that kind of thing. There were these mandatory safety standards I mentioned, which everyone had to adhere to. And then there were the industry specific protocols. And I think there was just a lot of buy-in for that. I was always amazed how early on industry groups formed a point of view about how they were going to operate safely, right? And they knew they had to operate differently. It had to be safe for customers and employees and visitors. And we got very, very early on, I'm literally talking a year ago, incredibly well-formed thoughts from people about how to reconfigure their workplaces, how they were going to operate safely. So,
that's exciting. So, speaking for somebody who now is going on about 60 weeks of working from home, that's kind of that, again, with I will say the luxury of having kept my job, I'll be honest, and being able to work from home. There's some long lasting effects now. As we're coming out, you guys have been able to kind of get us to a point where, my kids are going back to school. Tomorrow is the 28th. They're gonna, in Lexington, the middle schoolers will all be in at once. And so I think that's a huge milestone. It gets us all back again. How are you guys thinking about kind of now the reopening, some of the long lasting effects?
I am really, really concerned about what this means for societal inequities. Okay. So for perspective, so by way of background, in our state, every new term of a governor requires the development of a new economic development plan for the state. Okay. And so governor got reelected in November of 2018. So 2019, we spent a lot of time developing a new economic development plan for Massachusetts. And at that time, we'd added a couple 100,000 jobs since the start of the Baker administration. Unemployment was 2.9%. Incomes were rising. Everything on the surface looked like it was going really well, and it was. But even at that point, we said we have a housing crisis, and I can talk some more about that. Yeah. Even at that point, we said that minority-owned businesses lack the same kind of access to capital and assistance that other businesses do. At that time, we said we had issues in terms of workforce skills development. We had to have a more robust set of strategies there. And then the pandemic happened, and all those issues were exposed in really, really dramatic ways. And you think about the fact that so many people could continue to work remotely, but also many people couldn't, right? And the impacts on those individuals and those businesses. The housing situation is just, I mean, it is an undeniable fact that the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on communities of color in the state. And the governor formed, again, tapping the incredible resources of talent and expertise in Massachusetts, formed a health equity advisory group to try to explain that. And one of the root cause issues identified was housing, that people are living in crowded housing conditions because they can't afford other types of housing. And you think about the impact of in a single household, people who are frontline workers coming home to multi-generational families, and what that does for virus transmission. It really exposed our housing crisis in some pretty dramatic ways. And by the way, it did so at a time last summer when we all started talking a lot more about issues of racial equity. So these are really, really big societal issues. I'm not expert enough to talk about the disparities in healthcare, but I know they're there. So from an equity standpoint and a societal impact standpoint, the pandemic has just wreaked havoc on a whole set of issues we knew were there in what looked like very good times. But now we'll be working on this stuff for a very, very long time.
Yeah, again, these crises, seem to kind of amplify the differences.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
And kind of how we kind of respond to them. I think that's perhaps one of the positive outcomes. Kind of I don't remember a time, I think, and again, where driving around the lawn signs are so, and again, I drive in Lexington, but so remarkably thoughtful about social justice issues, and how in a time of a crisis, that this is a place, this is something that has kind of risen to the top. So being able to maintain that momentum is going to be our struggle.
Yeah. The lawn signs one is an important point. It does show where people's hearts and minds are. I mentioned housing before. There was a couple not so funny anecdotes from last summer where people had multiple lawn signs. One was Black Lives Matter, and the second was a lawn sign protesting the latest affordable housing development in their backyard on the same lawn, without a sense of irony. And so I think it does. There are things we can all do as citizens about the issues we care about, and I think the housing one is a big one. I'm happy to spend a lot more time on that one, by the way. It's a really, really important one.
Yeah, I think we could. I think that the housing crisis, and this one may seem a little bit, kind of outside of that, but there is also the, what does work look like? So maybe we could go through the housing questions that, I know that's in your bailiwick. And then the question is really like, how do we think about housing and work, as part of the future?
Yeah. So let me start with, as we called it, the housing crisis. And by the way, we called it the housing crisis long before we ever heard of COVID-19. So this goes back a long, long time. And a few basic numbers. So from 1960 to 1990 in Massachusetts, we produced about 900,000 new housing units. And from 1990 till 2020, we produced about 440,000. So think about that for a second. In a single generation, we cut in half our level of housing production at a time when our economy grew, our population grew, and supply and demand being what it is, we have falling supply and rising demand. What do we have? We have rising prices. And so, and I think this is not a crisis that you see every day, and it's one you frankly probably don't see in Lexington. But what we've done when we cut off housing production in that way, particular affordable multifamily housing, has had enormous impacts on our state, and we're trying to reverse that. And so we've had now, where I think we're number 3 in home value. For a long time, we were number 1 in rent for a 2-bedroom apartment. The governor and I sort of tell the same joke about we like to be number 1 in things, but not number 1 in rent. We have about half of our households are deemed to be cost burdened by housing, which means they're paying at least 30% of their income on housing. A quarter of our renters in Massachusetts pay at least 50% of their income on housing. And it has created conditions that in, pre-pandemic were expensive and inconvenient, and in the midst of a pandemic are sort of downright dangerous, these crowded housing conditions. And it's really incumbent on all of us, I think all of our communities, to develop a lot more housing. And so we tried to address that a few different ways. We invest a lot of money directly into the affordable housing ecosystem. We've invested about $1.4 billion so far to create about 20,000 affordable housing units around the state. And the whole affordable housing production world is just fascinating. It's just sort of getting back to this theme of collaboration, the amount of collaboration between state government, local government, private sector sources of financing, nonprofit sources, community groups. It's just this incredibly collaborative effort, and that's how affordable housing gets developed. So we continue to make these investments directly in creating affordable housing. We also, in the midst of this last year, passed the most significant zoning reform in probably about 50 years. And so the legislature passed and the governor signed an economic development bill in January, which included the governor's housing choice initiative. And I think it took 3 years for us to get this one done, but I think it's very, very important. What it does is makes it easier to rezone properties for housing. And so going back to 1920, it's been state law in Massachusetts that all rezonings are local decisions, which I think is appropriate, by the way. But they all require a 2/3 vote of town meeting or city council. 2/3 is a really, really high threshold. And our housing choice initiative, which passed, for a set of housing best practices, mostly around creating more multifamily housing, more density in downtown or public transit, it lowers that approval threshold to a simple majority. And so when and if such proposals come before Lexington town meeting, you need 50% plus one, not 2/3 plus one. That's a really simple change. I think it's going to be enormously impactful, because I can tell you we have a running list of proposals around the state that got a solid majority, but not a super majority. I think it's also had an enormous impact on how people think about what proposals they want to bring forward, knowing that this 2/3 threshold is really high. So we have to develop a lot more housing. And I think between zoning reform and more capital, I think we're going to get there. But this is a crisis. This has had an enormous impact on our citizens, our communities, our ability to compete economically, and we gotta get after it.
Yeah, one of the things I was reminded of, I was lucky enough to do some, traveling over the kids' school break, and picked up the local paper in the Berkshires, talking about how all these people are moving to these rural communities, and kind of the work from home, and how is that something that affected us both on the work from home? How does that change our society? And then also commercial real estate. Right. The biotech community, we need labs, but not everybody needs to be at work.
Yeah, it's a great point. So we're doing a study on this right now, the whole future of work, okay, and trying to understand what does work from home mean right now? What does it mean in terms of where people want to live, where they want to work? How do we think about the kind of planning we need to make, the planning our cities and towns need to do? What does it mean for infrastructure investment, housing development, broadband investment? There's a lot that goes into that, and we're really trying to anticipate, what it all means. The biggest question for us that sort of wraps around a lot of that is how are we going to compete economically? And we've always been a state where we compete on talent. And in a world where talent is perceived to be more mobile, right? How do we make sure we're a place that's going to develop talent and retain talent? It's a really, really important question. And, and this could cut it a lot of different ways. Well, for example, we look at it by sector. So life sciences, by definition, has to have a physical location. And we are, as I said, the global leader. I think that one will continue to grow nicely. We hope to grow our life sciences manufacturing capabilities, because those, again, it's a nice addition to our incredible expertise in research and development. But if we can grow manufacturing jobs, I think that also those are jobs that depend on a physical location. And it's a nice way to enhance the overall ecosystem. But think about the number of people working in technology, finance, professional services, doing jobs that can be done remotely. What does it mean? Does it mean we're at risk of losing some of those jobs? So we worry a lot about that, and we're studying that now. We got to come up with a set of strategies. I do We do need to make sure we continue to make policy choices to make this a place where people want to be. And we have had for a very long time now in Massachusetts, we have been such a net winner of so many globally important trends for a long period of time. We are a preeminent knowledge economy, right? And so we have been a net winner on that stuff for a long time. But now we're in a different environment. We've had, as I mentioned, a lot of these inequities exposed in ways that they weren't before, and talent is more mobile. What does it all mean? How do we make sure we're developing talent the way we were before? How do we make sure we're addressing some of these inequities? How do we make sure we're the place that's been, continues to be a net winner in these global trends?
Well, exciting, and I look forward to how you guys move on the future of work. I think I'm going to transition to some of our questions now from our audience. It's tricky to say the word audience because I can't see any of you guys, but thank you for putting in Q&A questions into the chat. One of the questions, and very Lexingtonian, how's the relationship with the federal government changed over the last 3 months? And what was it like? Personally, the idea that Massachusetts was able to become self-sufficient is kind of a remarkable point of pride for me, to be able to make sure, but it wasn't the case for the rest of the country because of some of the, I'll just say it, missteps at the federal level. How has that changed, and how did you guys deal with us?
Well, it became clear really early on that there was not a national strategy. Okay. And so we were really left to our own devices to make the kind of strategic decisions I talked about before. And again, thank God we have all the talent we have here in Massachusetts to help us make those. But it just became clear early on there was not a coordinated national strategy. I don't think that's a controversial statement. And so we were kind of on our own in that respect. Now, to offer a more positive interpretation of what the Fed said, the amount of financial resources provided have been enormous. And that also, I think, is kind of undeniable. So you think about, small business support. We now, as a state, through the Paycheck Protection Program and other programs run by the Small Business Administration, we've gotten about $22 billion in capital that's come in to help Massachusetts small businesses. And so, and through the CARES Act and the legislation signed in December and the American Recovery Act, now we're talking about unprecedented amounts of money. And so I think it's really been a mixed bag in terms of our relationship with the federal government. On the one hand, we were on our own to make the kind of strategic decisions we had to make. On the other hand, the financial resources have been terrific.
So I think I think playing off the positive views, are there some things that you can see that we've learned to do that we, over the course of this last year that you believe will persist and is a real positive outcome? The silver lining.
It's a great question. The way we support small business today is fundamentally different. We've scaled up a lot of things, some of which we were doing already, but scaled up in a much different way. So again, with a focus on minority-owned small businesses, the amount of capital we're directing to those companies now is unprecedented. Our engagement with community development corporations and community development financial institutions, the capital we're providing to them, and again, with great help from the federal government and some of that stuff. We have a great network of small business technical assistance providers. We provided that network a lot more funding. The efforts there are a lot more coordinated and better financed than they ever were before. And part of that's benefited by large sums of money from the federal government. I think a lot of that stuff's going to continue. We just know a lot more, again, in terms of things the pandemic exposed. We know a lot more about the needs of those businesses. The manufacturing stuff I touched on, that is with us, I think, for a long period of time now, our expertise in that arena. I think the way we think about our downtowns, so much of the economic damage has been on Main Street, right? Restaurant, retail, hospitality, other services, and we've spent a lot of time thinking about what our downtowns look like. So we've got this great program called Shared Streets and Spaces. I think Lexington's gotten one of these grants, but to help our cities and towns build up more outdoor activity and commerce and dining. So I think people are going to want to do more things outdoors. That influences our thinking about community development and downtown development. That's another thing. I think there's a lot of things that have come out of it. Telehealth is another one. I'm not that well equipped to talk about it, but we're doing a lot more online, right? I think telehealth has gotten pretty good reviews as well. So I think there are a number of things that are going to be with us. But again, I do hope that the difficult issues that the pandemic has shown a spotlight on. I hope people's memories don't fade on that stuff. We have to address housing. We have to address our workforce issues. We have to address issues of racial equity generally. And I hope people keep that stuff front and center.
Yeah, and another question related to, I think, kind of a double click on some of the housing. How can the state move forward to break logjam of lack of multiple family housing due to local town resistance? Is that something?
Well, that's the zoning reform I mentioned, right? And so I think that's going to have a big impact. And again, I think it was very important to emphasize that these are local decisions, right? And so housing choice doesn't change the fact that rezonings happen at the local level. It just changes how you keep score, basically. So a simple majority will carry the day. I think that also part of the economic development bill was the idea that so-called MBTA communities served by public transit, now need to have a zone for multifamily housing. And that is completely new for us. And so we're spending a lot of time now on sort of the implementation details of that. What does that mean? And I think that has enormous potential. And by the way, if we create affordable multifamily housing near public transit, that is really smart housing policy, really smart transit policy, really smart climate policy. That's a winner all day long. So we're going to see a lot more of that, I think.
Yeah, and that'll keep people here. Kind of.
Hope so, yeah.
That's part. So. Yeah, that's part of that's part of the attraction. So, another question, from our audience. Do you have any suggestions for encouraging doubters to get vaccinated? And is there a plan for this?
Yeah, not in my portfolio, but I know that we have an active effort on that about educating people about the vaccine. There have been some studies recently about this. I think we are among the lowest, the lowest state in terms of hesitancy around the vaccine. We do tend to be a population that respects science and listens to some of the facts on these things. So, but there is an active campaign on that one. But right now, I think we're doing pretty darn well on that score. Yeah.
Agreed. So one of the other kind of amplification, kind of disparities that have come forward is really around food insecurity related to the pandemic. And is that something that how are you and the Baker government thinking about that?
A few different ways. We tend to do a lot of things by grant programs, right? We make capital available and grant it out to people. So we had a program last year called the Food Infrastructure Security Grant Program, where it was grants to help people build out sort of better supply chains and infrastructure around food delivery. And that went to a lot of nonprofits to help them with their work. We're going to follow that up, I believe. I don't want to break any news here, but with programs that's more sort of operating dollars for people, probably to go through our community foundations and help them deal with food insecurity issues. It's a big issue. It's a really big issue. But both in terms of helping people build out the infrastructure they need and following that up with some operating dollars to help them get more food through that delivery channel. I think that's going to be helpful, but it's a big issue for sure.
So, the other area that, kind of, again, kind of moving towards, again, the science here, there is this sense that this is potentially a new normal, that what we're thinking about is that maybe, either not new microbial disease, but we should be prepared for this, right? Potentially.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And how are you guys thinking about it? I mean, again, it's not the thing that you want to carry around with you every day.
Right. Look, I think when I think back over the last 14 months, I mean, we were reacting to the best data we had at all times, right? We learned a lot more about this, right? And so maybe there's things we wish we'd known then, right? I'm sure there are for all of us, right? for example, with this virus, and the governor said this, asymptomatic spread was not as well known early on, right? That drove a whole set of decisions. All right, so that's one thing. But look, there's so much we learned the last 14 months, and I think we the way we sort of again harness the energies of both the public sector and the private sector to deal with these things. Hopefully we have something that looks like a playbook at this point, right? In terms of the way the healthcare system responded, the way the manufacturing system responded, the way the small business support system responded, there's a lot of things that have happened in the last 14 months. So God forbid if we're in a similar place again, I think we'll have much more of a playbook now.
Yeah, well, again, kind of there's first one through the wall is always bloody, but kind of only those who learn are the people who can go forward. So I think that's an exciting thing to hear, that kind of you guys felt like you had a good playbook. You're going to be able to learn, and quite honestly, you have some people to call upon. We have some of the best people in the world to think about these issues, and I'm hoping that kind of just a shout out to the audience, that we'll be able to bring in some of those people who made these remarkable movements in healthcare to be able to bring us vaccinations on an unprecedented timescale. Typing in the sequence of the genome of a virus on one computer and then typing in the therapy on another computer.
It's unbelievable. Yeah,
it's an unbelievable.
I mean, we're sort of living this right now, right? But I think at some point we'll step back and say, we developed 3 vaccines in a matter of months, right? And when we launched the reopening plan in May of last year, we said the quote new normal depends on broad availability of vaccines. Well, now we have that. That's unbelievable. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's very exciting. And again, can't say enough about the fact that Massachusetts played such a critical role in that part. So let me hit some of the other ones. Kind of again, on the note of positives, do you see long-lasting environmental benefits to less commuting, less traffic issues, strain on the roads?
We certainly could. I think this gets back to trying to study the future of work and what does it mean, right? And so we're developing a model around this, around what, to what degree will work from home persist, right? And if people are working in hybrid models, for example, and going into an office in Boston 2 or 3 days a week, enormous impact on traffic, right? So we'll know more about that one. I will say, right now I feel like we're getting a lot of different data points on that, and there's probably some conflict in them. So we're hearing from big employers saying they are going to implement hybrid models long-term, rethink their office footprint. At any given point in time, if fewer people coming into Boston, for example, that's one decision. Then we have Amazon putting 3,000 new jobs in the seaport a few months ago, right? So just very, very different. So it's there's a lot coming at us right now on that one, and we'll get a clearer sense, I think, over the next few months.
Yeah, let me see. So I guess kind of again on the environmental goals. Do you have any thoughts on kind of, as we think about maybe moving away from the pandemic a little bit, thinking about net zero environmental goals and how the business community has a role to play? There's a broader, we're opening this up a little bit, but
again, that's not my real area of expertise. The governor just signed a major climate bill in the last couple of weeks, right? Which commits to get us to net zero. So I think that's it's on a lot of people's minds. The business community's engagement on that issue has been terrific, and people know we need to get there. I do within my portfolio, I do worry, for example, about is it time now, for example, to have net zero buildings, right? And the incremental cost of developing that affordable multifamily housing we need, and is the technology ready now for that? So I think these are really important goals. As always, you have to think about the overall goals we have, but that's one area of concern I've got. But no, I think there's been just a ton of good engagement on this issue. I think the bill is a terrific bill, and these are really, really important goals for us. And again, get back to my comment on transit-oriented development, that is just a really, really smart thing to do from a climate standpoint as well.
So, one of the things that, just to go back, even just half an hour when you talked about, kind of, being, thoughtful about spending time in the public sector and then having, transition from the private sector. What do you feel like that brought to this particular, kind of set of questions? The fact that you had spent time there and here, you had a plan, and, how did it play out, in the context of the pandemic?
It's a good question. Look, I think, so in my private equity career, it was about 19 years. And I worked for firms we were very actively trying to find new companies. It was a very sort of outbound strategy of calling on companies and trying to find the best ones. And so by my count, I traveled to about 40 states and probably met with 1,000 CEOs in their offices. That collectively was a pretty good education around entrepreneurship and business development, having seen that many companies across that broad cross section of the country. And so I think what I can bring to the table is some knowledge of just how companies are run, right? And the types of decisions business leaders have to make. And again, recognizing that the decisions we took early on in the pandemic were just incredibly tough for our small businesses. And we knew that it had to be done, though, in a lot of ways. But I think just knowledge of how jobs get created, how companies are run, how business leaders think about decisions and trade-offs, I think that's helped me in a lot of aspects of this work for sure.
Yeah, and I would imagine that being able to speak multiple languages is a remarkably helpful facility.
Yeah,
understanding what somebody's thinking about, what is their objective function, like how are they?
Right. I think that's right. I think also appreciation for the innovation economy, because a lot of my work in growth private equity dealt with companies and innovation. That again is just, we talked about life sciences, think about the areas we lead in broadly in innovation around advanced manufacturing, software, digital health. We're trying to develop strategies now around AI and blockchain and quantum computing and robotics. There's so many exciting areas of innovation, and just appreciation for that. What does it mean to be a leader in a segment of the innovation economy, and all the follow-on effects that come from that? That is really powerful stuff. And I think for us, you talk about coming out of the pandemic, things we want to get done. We want to think about what's next around innovation. What are those sectors we might have some natural competitive advantages? How do we build on that and have a really interesting growing cluster in some of those sectors?
Yeah, and I love this question, because it really does kind of, as you say, coming out of the kind of reviving tourism. In messages when we get to travel.
It's a great question. We've been rolling out a series of programs now to help the tourism part of our economy. We've had a campaign called the My Local MA campaign, which maybe people have seen on TV or seen elsewhere. But the idea is to really encourage people to shop and dine and visit locally. Okay, and so part of it is a shopping angle where before you go online to make that purchase, think about the main street store that may sell the item you want, right? And go spend your money locally in your town. Become a tourist within Massachusetts. Go visit all the great destinations we have within state. So really getting people to think about investing locally from a consumer standpoint. Shopping, dining, and traveling is one thing. We rolled out, we spend about $10 million a year of state money on tourism marketing through our regional tourism councils. We continue to make those investments. So those are important ones. We rolled out a tourism recovery grant program last week. We granted additional capital to chambers of commerce and these regional tourism councils to continue their marketing efforts. We've launched a capital program called the Destination Development Capital Program, help on a regional basis invest in our local tourism assets in terms of renovations and improvements and expansion. So we're coming at this from a lot of different angles. We're rolling out a restaurant promotion campaign shortly. So we recognize that the need is there, and that sector has been disrupted for sure. And so, one long-term question for us is, how do we think about international travel? When is that going to come back, right? I think right now our efforts are better served on domestic marketing versus international, but to be determined on that one.
Well, I can't wait for all those buses to show up at the Minuteman statue, right? People come and get their
That's right.
get their taste
That's
of American history right here.
That's right. That's right.
Well, with that, I kind of want to conclude the evening. I thank you so much, Secretary, for appearing and being our first Science Cafe. You did wonderfully get an A. As a professor, I think I can give those out.
That might be my first day in science, so thank you.
Well, happy to be that. Happy to be that that professor that you remember. And please, kind of, I know that we didn't get to answer all the questions, but thank you again for your service. Thank you again for what you guys have done in Massachusetts to steward us through this this tough time. So and thank you again for doing one in your backyard. Thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you all. Great
Thank you.
discussion, great questions, and I guess my final thought is we're going to get through this, and we're going to get through it together. Again, that spirit of collaboration and cooperation, we will come out of this for sure and come out of it stronger.
And from the Cary Library, we also want to thank you for being here, and Jagesh for doing that wonderful moderation of the questions and the conversation, and for the Cary Library Foundation again for helping us bring this back, because it's such an important thing for our community to have these kind of conversations. So thank you again, both of you, very, very much.
Thank you, Mina, again.
Great night, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, everybody that's
Take care.
here, thanks for being here, and we'll have a good night.
Have a good evening. Take care.
Thanks.
Good night.